also outline a range of projects that we're currently working on that focus on some aspects of the societal benefits of trees, woods and forests. So some of the work that we talk about today is complete. Some of it is ongoing. If you'd like to find out more after the webinar, then please do get in touch with us. And the majority of the work that we focus on today is England focused, but not all of it. So the Society and Environment Research Group at FR, we're a team of 18 and still growing. We undertake research across the UK, but we also collaborate with international partners and collaborators. We're based across different parts of the country, as you can see from this slide, and you can find out more about our individual staff from the Forest Research website. We do come from a range of social science disciplines, from anthropology to sociology, psychology, human geography. And our research covers a number of kind of key themes. So one is around kind of well-being benefits of treescapes, and this work covers things around physical, social and mental health benefits of trees, barriers to accessing trees and woods. We've carried out research on learning in woodlands, whether that's informal or formal. We've done work on volunteering and pro-environmental behaviours, and we've also been involved in evaluating interventions that focus on well-being. We've also got a theme around the social dimensions of tree health. So that covers things around kind of knowledge and awareness of pests and diseases, the social acceptability of management options to control pests and diseases, things around risk communication, and how best to engage people in biosecurity practices. Our research with land managers focuses on their attitudes and behaviours around things like woodland creation, managing woodlands, and their sort of land manager knowledge needs. And we're also involved in evaluating some interventions that are focused on land managers. And then finally, our work on the human dimensions of wildlife management covers things again around kind of knowledge and awareness of publics and stakeholders, and attitudes towards different species, acceptability of management and control options, and social feasibility of species reintroduction. But today we're focusing on the societal benefits, and that mainly comes under our well-being theme. So the societal benefits of trees, woods and forests is one of 7 core funded programmes within forest research. And this research has come about through the Science and Innovation Strategy for Forestry in Britain. And we've got 2 kind of work areas within Programme 3 focused on the societal benefits. So one's focused more on understanding perspectives of different sectors of society concerning trees and woods, and the other is focusing more on kind of methods and technologies for understanding more about how people connect with trees and woodlands, and also how we can collect data through new technologies on what people are doing and where they're going. The majority of the funding for our research group comes from external funding, and that can be a whole range of different kind of funding bodies, from Research Council, Horizon Europe, DEFRA, Forestry England, Forest Services, a whole range of different bodies where we bid in for research. So the research that we're outlining today covers both some of our core funded work and some of our external research as well. So that's a bit of an introduction to our group, and I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Claire, who's going to talk about some of the work that she's doing in work area 1 within Programme 3, which is focused on societal benefits. So over to you, Claire.
Great, thanks, Liz, and hello to everybody. It's nice to see so many people on the call today. Yeah, so as Liz has just said, I'm going to talk about some of the work that is ongoing within Programme 3, so our core funded work, and I'm the work area lead for work area 1. So that's obviously what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. So this is just to repeat what Liz has just presented to you. This is the work area focused on societal perspectives of and engagement with urban, peri-urban and rural treescapes. So the approach we've taken to this work area is that we're doing a series of evidence reviews. So that's obviously looking at previous literature and publications relevant to specific topics and synthesizing the evidence that already exists on these topics, and then having identified gaps within those reviews, we're then going out to do some of our own research on the ground, as it were, in different case study locations. So there were 3 review topics that were agreed at the stage of writing the proposal for the overall programme. We've completed 2 of those reviews already. So review 1 is already published, actually, up on the Forest Research website, and the link is in one of my slides a bit further ahead. So if you wanted to have a look at that afterwards, it is available. The second review, I'm kind of in the process of just tidying it up a little bit more before it's ready to be published on our website, but it should be out there very soon. And then the case study work, we've just begun this actually in Wales, so I'll talk about that a little bit as well this morning. We spent quite a lot of time in the kind of early months of the programme talking to the steering group about which regions we should focus on for the case study work. So the decision was taken kind of jointly, as I say, with our steering group colleagues from Scotland, England and Wales. And the decision was taken to use the Clyde Climate Forest region in Scotland, the Northern Forest region in England, and then an area in South Wales, which is sort of south of the Brecon Beacons National Park, and then between Swansea and Cardiff. As I say, we've already started some work in South Wales, which I will talk about. And then hopefully this morning, if I don't run out of time, I've got a couple of slides to talk about a third piece of work that we have done under Work Area 1, which is some secondary data analysis using the People and Nature Survey data set for England. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the first review that we have already completed. So this review topic that we were asked to look at was looking at public perspectives of treescape creation, expansion, management and maintenance. So effectively, how do people feel about new tree planting, and then how trees are managed and maintained in their area or in places that they might visit. So we actually uncovered 95 relevant publications for this work from 17 countries. We searched between the years 1990 and present day at the time of doing the review. So the studies that we've actually included in the review are from 1994 to 2022 inclusive. 36 of the studies were conducted in the UK. Obviously, context is quite important for these sorts of studies. So yeah, I think it's quite positive that a significant number of these studies were from the UK. We did this work almost as 2 different reviews. A couple of colleagues who actually have since left were responsible for searching for the literature under these 2 areas. So Mandy Cook, who used to work with us, she sought out the literature on people's perspectives of treescape creation and expansion. And another colleague has also left, Francesca Boyd. She looked at the literature on perspectives of management and maintenance of treescapes. And the way that we've presented those findings in the report are for the creation and expansion work. The literature actually falls quite neatly into 2 different sort of settings. So it's people's views of tree planting and expansion in urban settings, and then looking at a kind of much bigger scale afforestation, so views about larger scale, what we might call plantation forestry. And similarly for the management and maintenance evidence, the evidence on that, we looked at people's views, again, in different contexts of different types of location. So again, kind of urban management of trees in urban areas, and then and management of trees, again, in forestry. But then also what was quite clear from the literature is that people's views about the management of trees and the maintenance of trees actually differs depending on what the purpose of that management is. So that's also forms part of the structure of the report. Okay, so obviously we don't have time today to kind of present all of the evidence that we managed to find. So I've just kind of picked out a few bits and pieces in the next few slides from this first review. So as regards public perspectives of trees in urban areas and the planting of street trees, I think generally the evidence tells us, and I think this isn't really a surprise, the evidence tells us that people, generally speaking, are quite positive about having trees on the street where they might live, or the places that they might pass through as they're going about their daily lives. And that's often to do with, benefits to do with aesthetics, how it looks, how it makes the place feel, and also provides additional benefits, perhaps the sort of shade and so on, and shelter from different types of weather through the year. But in terms of what specific types of trees people might like to see planted on streets, if new tree planting is to be done, this evidence actually is largely, I think, from the US. And it was one of the suggestions is that people like large trees on streets, which I think is quite interesting because I think across the UK there's now a tendency, if there's new street tree planting, it's more likely to be the sort of smaller species, sort of birch, rowan, cherry, etc. And people like to see a mix of species, so they like that kind of seasonal change and variety through the year to keep a kind of ongoing interest. Again, I think that's quite interesting because I guess historically, certainly the places of Britain that I'm familiar with, there's very much a kind of, there was a tendency to plant the same species along streets. But again, I think that is changing. So lots of positives around people's perspectives of trees in urban areas and along streets, but also, of course, there are concerns, and I don't think this probably won't be any surprise to anybody on the call today, that there is evidence that obviously people do get concerned, particularly if they've seen perhaps new planting in urban areas, and then it appears not to be maintained at all. So this can, cause them to be a bit concerned about the idea that there might be more new trees planted if they've seen in the past that it's not really been maintained particularly well. There's also potential problems if people don't feel involved in decision making about what's happening in their local area in terms of planting and maintenance. So I think it's important, obviously, to try to address that with any new planting going forward. And then just a whole range of perceptions, negative perceptions, sometimes from some people about their own kind of perceived problems with perhaps pests, and I think that means, insects and so on. Allergies, obviously tree pollen can be a problem for people, concerns about leaves on pavements and so on, blocking drains, and maybe infrastructural damage from roots. These are all, kind of well-known issues that can be associated with trees in urban areas. Next slide, please, Liz. So as I say, we did look at kind of perspectives of planting and management and so on in different locations. So these were just some of the findings around public perspectives of the more kind of larger scale planting and afforestation. And a lot of this evidence is UK evidence. And I think, again, probably no surprise, there's now a kind of, I think, an understanding that what happened originally with afforestation, in the early 1900s, in the early days of Forestry Commission, the lessons from that approach to large scale afforestation, I think, have largely been learned. So, there is a recognition that people don't necessarily respond very positively to large-scale monocultures, clear felling, and forests that are not accessible, that appear to kind of shut off large areas of countryside. So I think, you know, these views are quite well established now, and some of those issues are being addressed with new afforestation. But clearly, when you're planting for commercial timber, some of these things are perhaps not, you know, not completely avoidable. And also, so again, similarly to tree planting in urban areas, this idea that, you know, involving people in decisions about new planting projects is very important. Involved in those sorts of issues, but there will, generally speaking, in most areas be some people who feel that they want to have a voice. If that, you know, it's their local environment, they want to be able to be involved in decisions. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, so also from review 1, as I say, we had this part of the review which focused much more on the kind of management and maintenance of trees. I've already talked a little bit about that, but one of the things that we found in the review was that, as I think I said earlier, people's responses to management can be related to, well, what is that management for? You know, is it for wildlife and nature? Is it for kind of broader ecosystem service provision? Is it for some other reason? And there's quite a bit of literature now, GB literature, on managing trees for pests and diseases. So we looked at some of the evidence, the studies that have been published in relation to OPM, ash dieback, and so on. So broadly speaking, once people understand that, you know, there is a problem with a pest or a disease, then, you know, they will broadly support whatever management might be going on, whether that is felling or some sort of treatment where that's possible. Obviously, that depends what the pest or disease is. Some of the things that we found in some of the studies, you know, generally speaking, people perceive more natural management techniques to be preferable to something like chemical control. So if there is an option for some sort of biological control using a, you know, an introduced pest predator, for example, that might be preferred. Some differences in demographics. There seemed to be a tendency for some approaches more acceptable, for example, to men and older people in some cases, particularly where that might be perhaps more, you know, new kind of innovative technologies that perhaps people are a little wary of in some cases. Again, as I say, some kind of demographic differences may be in responses to approaches like that if they were to be introduced. And it also depends who's doing the management. We found that some people seem to respond more positively to the idea of managing trees for disease if they have perhaps a greater trust in the organisation that's doing the work, and that might well be charities rather than sort of private landowners. Next slide, please, Liz. So in terms of gaps that we found in this review, so this is the work that this is the kind of output, if you like, from the review that we will take forward, that we already are taking forward into the case study work to try and address some of these gaps. So, you know, a lot of social studies will always look at the socio-demographics of people and how their preferences or their attitudes, their opinions, how they differ between different socio-demographic groups. And I've already talked about some of those findings, but it is often difficult to find consensus. You know, people hold different views, you know, whether they're young or old or male or female or you know, more educated, less educated. And it is often difficult to find consensus. And indeed, we did find a lack of consensus. Obviously, I have discussed a few findings about socio-demographic characteristics. But yes, but that consensus is often lacking. It's also important as to whether we're asking people, you know, their attitudes towards planting and management, etc., varies between whether we're talking about them as a local resident And so it's about what's going on in their local environment, or whether they're a visitor. We put here consumer, but whether they're a visitor or a tourist to an area. The next couple of points, or certainly the second point on this slide, again, so we found a lack of evidence, and this is really a kind of key part of the work we're trying to do in Work Area 1. It's how does the landscape change that arises when we plant or manage or remove trees? How does that impact on community views of their local landscape on a kind of broad scale? As I say, this is really kind of quite a key question for what we're trying to do in this work area, given all of the plans for new tree planting right across Britain. There are going to be some significant landscape change for local people. So how do they feel about that, and how does it impact on them? And then there's a couple of points around public views about the management and indeed planting of what we might call the small woodlands, peri-urban location woodlands, urban fringe. And I think probably quite a lot of people in Britain have contact with woodlands of this nature. It's on the edges of towns. It's kind of dotted amongst the farming landscape that they might walk through. But there's not very much evidence and literature on these types of locations. It tends to be focused on maybe urban areas, as I've discussed, or the kind of larger scale, perhaps more remote forestry plantations. And then there's evidence around street trees and kind of preferences for street trees. So I think I said what I reported was quite a bit of US literature on this topic. So again, it could be good to try and get some kind of GB evidence around that topic, because we didn't find it. Next slide, please, Liz. So the second review, so this isn't yet quite published. It is very, very nearly finished. So the topic for this one concerns, so what are artificial infrastructure and facilities and then natural features do people want to see when they visit green spaces with trees? So there's these kind of two aspects to this, the kind of artificial infrastructure and facilities, and then kind of other natural features. And again, we've kind of structured this across different types of location. So there's a focus in the first section on looking at trees in urban spaces, including urban parks, and then looking at these small local peri-urban woodlands, and then looking at the larger visitor destination forests. And we've split it between the international evidence and the evidence from the UK and Ireland. So this work's based on 40 studies, 14 of which are in the UK. And although we searched from 1990 to present day again, in fact, the studies included in the review are only from 2002 to present day. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, so there's lots of evidence about lots of different types of artificial infrastructure. And again, obviously haven't got time today to go through everything. Suffice to say, there is quite a lot of evidence relating to paths and seating and the preferences people have for that in terms of where and what it looks like and how much of it there is and how it's designed, etc. Now, whether that's because people have lots of opinions about that or just because lots of studies have chosen to focus on that, I suspect it's a bit of a mix. But the study does cover everything from paths, seating, signage, car parks, litter bins, toilets, cafes, information and maps and signs and so on. So there's a lot of detail in there, and I've kind of compiled that into a whole series of matrices, which will provide quite a kind of readily accessible output, I think, rather than just a kind of big report. So please look out for that on our website shortly. Okay, so there's quite a lot of information on this slide. I know I previously said that it's hard to find a consensus when we're talking about the differences between people and their kind of preferences based on social demographics, but actually there are some fairly clear messages coming out of this review, firstly relating to differences in gender. And it does seem to be, generally speaking, women have a greater preference for more facilities of whatever type than men. Now, this is a generalization, obviously, but the implication or the inference here seems to be that this is related to the fact that if you have more kind of facilities and infrastructure at a particular site, that probably means that there's going to be more people about. So we think this is related to, you know, perceptions of safety and security. So yeah, so generally speaking, it seems that women, females, seem to express this greater preference for any type of infrastructure facilities. When it comes to older age groups, again, there are some differences here coming through, particularly with things like benches and seats, perhaps not surprising, but a greater preference to see more benches and seats, basically, for older age groups and some of the other types of facilities. There's some quite interesting evidence around play facilities, play parks, play infrastructure, adventure play parks, go ape, all sorts of things. Quite a lot of literature around this, the views of parents. And while there's an appreciation that you know, people do generally like to see lots of these facilities, it gives them somewhere to go, keep the kids occupied. There's also this recognition that forests and woods and trees, you know, in particular, over and above other types of green space, maybe, have this opportunity for, you know, exploration and adventure, which is really important. So keeping them kind of natural and wild looking without necessarily the kind of artificial infrastructure can also be really positive. Okay, we didn't find a lot of literature on the kind of disability requirements or preferences of people less able or disabled, but a couple of points here. One of the things is that there is a need, and I think this is beginning, I think this has changed slightly since the literature probably, but there is this need to recognise that, you know, disabled means many, many things. And it's not just about, you know, people who are less able or use a wheelchair. So in terms of providing facilities and infrastructure, that needs to be taken into consideration. And also this idea, I think this was a kind of one study in particular, but some less able people actually don't want everything that's kind of easy access necessarily. So overall, I think one of the things that we kind of conclude from this review is that its life stage is actually really important in terms of defining what types of facilities and infrastructure different people might actually want to see. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, but so as well as life stage influencing preferences for infrastructure, there's also quite a lot, again, in the evidence, in the literature about, it depends what types of activities people like to do. So obviously we're not necessarily defined by our preferred activity, but if we think of people as being joggers or walkers or cyclists or horse riders or bird watchers, etc., these things influence the types of the facilities and infrastructure that people want to see, particularly as regards things like tracks and trails. There's quite a lot of evidence around that, but also in terms of open spaces. So, you know, if people like to partake in group activities, there's a greater preference for open spaces amongst their kind of forested, wooded, treed areas. And yeah, so one of the things we've again kind of discussed in the review is that there's almost this continuum of green space stroke forest users, from people at almost one end of the spectrum who want to see more facilities to those who actually want to see or like a place to feel wilder. So that, again, there's quite a bit in the review about that. And then this final point, which actually doesn't fit under the heading it's under, it's its own heading, if you like. So we structured the review around, because the review question was about facilities and natural features. But then there's this third element of what we've called social infrastructure, which has come out of the review. So very much about, it's not necessarily things alongside trees, it's about people and activities and events, space for socializing and gathering. And these can be very important, particularly to certain groups. So that also is in the review. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, so yeah, so I've talked a lot about the facilities and infrastructure, but obviously the other part the review was, what are the natural features are preferred alongside trees. So again, we've looked at this across the 3 different types of green space. So we've looked at it in terms of urban green spaces with trees, the sort of smaller woodlands, peri-urban woodlands, and then the larger forests. There is certainly quite a bit of evidence around when we're talking about urban green spaces with trees, particularly parks in urban areas with trees. There's quite a bit of literature around how people kind of like those to look in terms of, other things associated with trees. So open spaces are very welcome, with maybe trees just around the edges or in patterns or patches, or rows along paths and so on, but not too wild. So this is quite a consistent message in terms of urban green spaces with trees, is that if there's treed areas in urban locations that don't appear to be very well managed, that are sort of left to be quite natural, they can generate feelings of not feeling particularly safe, being associated maybe with antisocial behaviour and so on. So that's very specific to urban green spaces. But ultimately, people seem to want this variety. So there's, again, quite a lot of evidence around park visitors. They want to see kind of grass and flowers and shrubs. Food-bearing plants also came through in some of the studies alongside trees. So trees are a very important part of that green infrastructure, but other things too, please, seem to be the message. In terms of the smaller woodlands, there's very little evidence. I mean, I've got a couple of bullet points there, but there's really not very much at all about what do people like to see in the smaller woodlands in terms of other natural features alongside trees. So that's definitely a gap. And then the large forests and other natural features. I think there's quite a lot of evidence now around this. And again, it's that kind of diversity. So we don't just want big forests with lots of trees. We'd like to see some water bodies. There's also some sort of preferences for clearings and open space, vistas and viewpoints, and so on. So again, it is that kind of, diversification, I guess, not just trees, but other things too, other features too. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay, so yeah, in terms of gaps from the second review, I've already touched on these a little bit, but the first point here is that there is a lot more literature, or at least that's what we have found, that focuses on people's preferences for artificial infrastructure and facilities, not so much on those other natural features, particularly in peri-urban woodlands, and to some extent the large forest parks, although, as I've just discussed, there are some studies and evidence. The evidence that we looked at around, preferences for play areas and that kind of infrastructure, it all seems to be from parents. So, oh, thank you. So, yeah, my colleague Katie Spencer, who worked on this review with me, she was very keen that we try and talk to young people about what do they want. And then, yeah, there's limited evidence. So the urban green space literature about trees is very much focused on parks. So we found a few studies on hospital grounds. I think there was one, and something about shopping malls with, the trees in those locations. But I think, there's lots of other types of urban green space where we might find trees, and there's very little evidence about what people might like to see. Next slide, please, Liz. Sorry.
Hi, Claire. Just to let you know, 5 minutes until the question and answers.
Yeah, sorry, I am keeping my eye on the time. Thanks, Liz. So I'll just quickly talk about the case study research that we have begun. So obviously I've covered those first 2 reviews and talked to you about some of the evidence, some of the gaps. And as I said, the idea of the case study research is that we try to find evidence where the gaps have been identified from the reviews. So there's a couple of the gaps here that I've got at the top of this slide from the first review. And we've just recently, in March this year, we've done some research in South Wales with a group of local people in a peri-urban woodland, an urban fringe woodland. And we had an opportunity to do a woodland discussion group, a woodland walk discussion group with 12, actually it was 11 people in the end, to discuss their views of some of the activities that had been taking place in this woodland, including felling, clear felling, natural regeneration, and volunteer management. And so, yeah, it was a really interesting couple of hours that we spent. I think I am going to run out of time, so I'm just going to touch on a few of these things. One of the things that was, I think, quite interesting was we stopped at a spot where there had been some mature beech trees felled last year, alongside a path and right at the back of houses. So this was very much an urban fringe woodland. And people's initial reaction when we stopped at this spot and asked them, you know, what do you think about what you're looking at, was, oh, you know, this, we don't like this. We'd rather see the trees. It did look a little bit untidy, I must admit, because, you know, some of the brash was still there. There was sort of scrubby growth starting to come through. This was early in the year, so everything was still looking a little bit bleak. But actually, as the discussion developed, people were able to realise and for themselves actually and say, well, now I can kind of see how, you know, it's a safety issue here potentially because it's right at the backs of houses. So I can see why these trees might have needed to be felled. It must be letting a lot more light into these people's houses, so that, you know, that's a kind of positive, and a recognition that disease can be a problem. So I think there had been a lot of larch felling elsewhere. This is in the valleys, and there had been some problems with Phytophthora, so people were aware of these issues. So, as I say, their initial reaction was maybe not particularly positive to what they were seeing, but actually, when they started discussing it a little bit more, they were able to demonstrate, you know, a kind of deeper understanding of why this might need to take place. Okay, I think, Liz, I'll just skip the rest of this slide, please, and move on. So obviously today we were asked to focus on England. So just to quickly say that the next part of our case study work, that was obviously Wales I've just talked about, but we want to do the same work in England, obviously. I'm just currently without a colleague to do this work with me, so we're just waiting for a new recruit to come in. And we've identified the site. I've been in touch and have had some, you know, I have some good ongoing discussions with colleagues at the University of Leeds, who many of you may be aware of this site within the White Rose Community Forest, a place called Garewood, just to the north of Leeds, owned by the University of Leeds. Previously was tenanted farmland, so there was a farmer grazing sheep on it. So a completely different site to the site in Wales that we've just visited. 66,000 new trees have just been planted. They've just completed this. So we're going to do again a kind of local, you know, a walk with local people around this site to get their views and impressions of what they're actually seeing in terms of landscape change and tree planting. And it's alongside an existing area of woodland that's actually quite unmanaged, so that will provide a good kind of a bit of variety for the discussion, a kind of different dimension to the discussion as well. So very excited to get on with that, hopefully in the next month or so. And I'm out of time, so I think I will finish there, Liz. That's okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. I think we'll go on to the questions, and then I'll come back to some of the other slides that we've got. Just see if there's any. So that's
That's good. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Claire and Liz, for that. We haven't got any questions at the moment, but encouraging people to put them in the chat. So we'll see if any come through.
I did see someone raise their hand at some point, but I think that's gone down.
Oh, got one here. So we'll just go to the question here is, how is the subject of research decided? Is it dictated by funding?
So I think I mentioned very briefly there were 3 review topics that were discussed and agreed. So at the point where the proposal for the whole program, the whole research program 3 was put together, I mean, I wasn't involved in that process, but there was a lot of discussion with colleagues, external colleagues, the policy colleagues and the funders within the 3 parts of Britain, so obviously Scotland, Wales and England. So my understanding is that those review topics, those review questions came directly from the kind of the policy colleagues and their what they saw as the important areas where they needed us to kind of look at the evidence on this. I don't know if Liz, you want to add anything more?
Just to say that with the core funded programs, which Claire's just been talking about, they do come from the Science Innovation Strategy for Forestry in Britain. So that was a lot of stakeholder engagement to refresh the strategy. And from that, Forest Research was tasked with developing kind of research programs, as Claire mentioned, with policy colleagues in Forestry Commission and its equivalents in each country.
Great, thanks Claire and Liz. I'll go to Jim Smith, who's got his hand up, and then I'll go back to the chat. So Jim, if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Millie. It was just a quick question. My experience is that the better well-used sites usually have toilet facilities. So I was just going to ask you, as part of the infrastructure that you saw, I was interested that you said women tended to like that better than men. Were toilet facilities included in part of your consideration of that, baby changing availability, that type of stuff?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So baby changing facilities weren't specifically mentioned in any of the evidence we looked at, but certainly toilets more generally were mentioned in a number of the studies. I'm trying to remember specifically what we found. I think we didn't find any difference for those in terms of men v women, but I think it was more important to older generations, again, perhaps not surprisingly, and it depended on location. I think this was the other thing. So they were more important in the kind of larger, perhaps what we might call visitor destination forests, again, understandably. So I think that's what the evidence was telling us. But maybe this is another issue for us to pick up on when we get to the case study research, to kind of follow up on that facility study, just to see, a little bit
Thanks
more.
very much. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So back to the chat questions. We've got one here from Tim. He's saying, is there any evidence of better outcomes when people have been involved in pre-management / planting ideas?
Certainly, again, I think, as I mentioned, people say that they do want to be involved in the decision making and they don't like not being involved in decision making, whether that's in an urban location or in the kind of larger scale planting. But that's a good question, whether the evidence of is the outcome better if people are involved. I mean, I think, generally we would expect that if people just are engaged and feel they've got a say and they have more buy-in to what's actually happening, that they're going to respond more positively to what's actually put in the ground, as it were.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And then Jessica said, were there regional differences in benefits and public opinion?
Okay, we didn't specifically look at where there regional differences, and obviously a lot of the studies are quite location specific. So I guess it would be possible to look at that, whether a study that's been done in Scotland is different to something that's been done in Sheffield, but we didn't specifically look at that, just because there's not we didn't find a big body of research in one area that we could then examine against a big body of research from another area. there were probably, you know, individual studies from lots of different places, but not enough to say there's a regional difference necessarily. I think the case study research is more likely to allow us to kind of look at that, because we are specifically using, you know, a location in Scotland, a location in England, and a location in Wales. And I think that's certainly one of our aims, is to just to kind of look at whether there are indeed those regional differences, whether that's to do with, you know, the evidence gaps from the first review around preferences for kind of planting and management and maintenance, or the second review around preferences for kind of facilities, infrastructure and natural features. As I say, it will allow us to look at that difference between England, Scotland, Wales. Yeah, so I think that will be quite interesting to see.
Great, thank you. And then one here from Joe. So he says, any work on perceptions of management in different types of urban areas and different places? For example, London versus other cities, large town versus small towns. And yeah, he says, great presentation, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the different location issue, I think I maybe sort of just touched on that with the previous answer. So I would say not enough evidence at different locations to be able to draw any conclusions. Sorry, what was the other part of the question? There were two bits to what you just said to me, sorry.
Yeah, so any work on the perceptions of management in different types of urban areas, different places.
Different types of urban areas.
Yeah, so like large cities, towns, small towns.
There is a bit of that, isn't there, Claire? You know, so Claire's talking about some of the review work that she's been doing with colleagues, but we've also had a project looking at the public perceptions of urban treescapes that had kind of qualitative component, but also kind of surveys of people in urban areas. And I think that sort of touched on, you know, large cities like London and other kind of slightly smaller towns. That is available on our website. I don't think there's a massive differences, but I can't recall off the top of my head, unfortunately. But we can point you to a report that might give some indication of that.
Yeah, sounds good. And then just probably got time for one more, but Miles has just said, can you say when the report will be released, as options for capital items for the new ELM grants are discussed at the moment?
Hoping for the end of May.
Cool.
Yeah, so there's just a little bit more work to be done tidying up before
Great.
it's fit for public consumption. So
great. So look out for it, and
yeah,
be on the Forest Research website, won't it?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Claire, for presenting.
Thanks.
And for all your questions, everybody. So I'm going to hand back to Liz now to cover her slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Nilly. Thanks, Claire, for doing that. So I'd like to touch on a number of projects. I'm not sure I'll get through them all, but some of them are ongoing, and we've also got some new projects that are starting. So the first one I'd like to mention is this one around kind of social and cultural values of treescapes that are at risk from pests and diseases. So this is work for DEFRA. We're trying to improve the representation of these values in tree health policy. We've been reviewing documents, reviewing the evidence, and we wanted to develop an approach that could be used in surveys. We wanted to develop a quantitative approach that would capture these social and cultural values, and then work with stakeholders to think about how they could be used kind of practically, potentially in things like local tree strategies. So in the evidence review that we carried out, covering 188 different papers and reports, work in the UK and international literature, and Claire led on this part of the project, there were 6 kind of categories of social and cultural value that kept being mentioned, that were the most mentioned. And they're outlined here. So things around kind of the importance of nature, wildlife to people, health and well-being benefits, the importance of learning, place and community, people's connections with place and community through forests, the spiritual and emotional, and then more around the sort of aesthetics and landscapes. So those kind of 6 categories, we wanted to develop we wanted to look at the kind of key things that came under those broad categories, and from those develop a series of statements that we could then use in a survey with the public. And after a lot of kind of iterative process of going back to the literature, looking at how it was worded in the literature, what kind of aspects of social and cultural values under each of these 6 categories we wanted to capture, we came up with a list of 19 statements. And so more or less about 3 statements per category. And this is how it looks within the survey. So, you know, the question is, I value my local trees and woodlands and forests because, and there's just a few examples here, you know, they provide me with a peaceful refuge. Being among them makes me feel part of something bigger than myself. They can help me learn about nature. So we've got 19. I'm not showing you all of them because we've just submitted a paper on this for review in the academic literature. But we did test those statements with 30 people. So interviewing them online and going through the survey, which had a number of other questions, not just the 19 statements. And then we made some changes based on their comments. And we then ran the survey with 5,000 people in England, representative by age, gender, and region. And there were 4 factors that we identified. So these are the statements that kind of correlate together into groups. So one was more about the kind of natural landscape benefits. One was more kind of covering kind of reflective and creative aspects, statements. One was more about kind of the social space, so people and communities coming together. And then one was about well-being, which covered things around kind of physical and mental health. When we ran the survey, excuse me, in England, we asked people to think about their local trees and woodlands, and then the 19 statements, and score those on a scale of 1 to 100, 0 to 100. And then we asked them about trees in England, woodlands and trees that they might never visit or see. And actually, we didn't find any difference between whether people are thinking locally or nationally. And we really didn't find much difference regionally either, which is quite interesting. We also had an open question, just asking people, you know, was there something missing from those kind of 19 statements that they felt should go in? Excuse me. And there wasn't anything really missing. There were a couple of things people mentioned that didn't really come under the kind of category of social and cultural value. But people did kind of spend some time just giving us some idea of why some of these categories were particularly important to them. So a couple of things here around well-being, quite powerful statements of someone who's housebound, seeing trees really improves their quality of life. Somebody whose partner has dementia and they get a day a week to themselves, and then they can go to woodlands and they find that really restorative experience. So got some nice data there about, you know, what these social and cultural values mean to people. We also asked it in relation to, would these values be impacted if there was a pest and disease outbreak that led to like large scale loss of trees, gradual slow decline of trees, the woodland was closed, or there was a loss of a small number of trees that were then replaced. And people did feel that the social and cultural values would be impacted, but particularly by large-scale loss of trees. And some differences, females were a bit more concerned than men, and higher income households a bit more concerned than lower income households that would impact their social and cultural values. As I say, we've submitted a paper on this, but there's also a practical use. We've been using this in an iTree eco survey, and I'm going to come on and talk about that. But also, this can potentially be used in relation to local authorities who are trying to develop or refresh their tree and woodland strategies. But also you could think about using these 19 statements in a surveys in the future to see about how values might change over time. So skip over that, we're a bit behind. But coming on to the iTree project, where we have used these 19 kind of statements of social and cultural values. iTree is a software application used to quantify the structure and environmental effects of urban trees and calculate their value to society. What we wanted to do in this project was to kind of test the inclusion of social and cultural ecosystem services. And we did that through field data collection and also an online survey with residents in the Wirral, which is where the study was focused. So there's kind of three main areas that we wanted to kind of capture. So one around public visibility, and the field surveyors, they were collecting data about, is this tree really visible to people? Is it partially visible or not particularly visible? In the survey, we asked people about, could they see trees from their house? Could they see at least three? Where were they? We also asked about accessibility. So is the tree, in the field survey, is the tree actually accessible to people? What route can people get to that tree if it is accessible? Is it on a cycleway, footpath, a natural footpath, some sort of paved way? And in the survey, we asked about, how often people visited woodlands, what prevents them, so understanding something about the barriers. We also wanted to kind of cover a spectrum from of socio kind of economic status. So we used the index of multiple deprivation. So we stratified our sample for the field survey by the 5 quintiles of IMD within the Wirral. And then in the survey, we just asked people their postcode, and then we were able to place them into one of those IMD quintiles. We ran the survey last year. The Wirral kind of publicised it through local papers, through their website. We got, a reasonably good response. So over 300 people responded to the survey. So trees in private gardens and on kind of residential streets, they represented more than half of the trees that people could see from their homes. But they kind of ranked quite low in terms of, trees that people felt made a positive impact. So you can see a bit from here. We also found that the most positive impact that people felt trees made was in sort of urban woodlands, but also in park and recreational areas and in public amenity areas. But quite a few people said they were already planting or they were keen to plant in their garden. So there is kind of potential to think about how you kind of up the profile, as it were, of kind of trees in gardens and the contribution they can make to the environment, but also to kind of people's neighbourhoods and to kind of social and cultural benefits. We looked at the IMD quintiles, so people in higher areas of deprivation. So that's in quintile 1 was the most deprived and quintile 5 was the least deprived. So in the more deprived, there were fewer trees, there was less canopy cover, less ecosystem service provision, a lower proportion of publicly accessible trees. And people in those areas did want more trees in their neighbourhood. So that's, quite interesting. But we did have a slight underrepresentation of people in the more deprived areas within our survey sample. So it would be kind of good to kind of think about how we can maybe do a bit more extra work to get into that a bit more and think about whether people in those more deprived areas think they've got kind of less power to kind of have a voice around trees in their local area. In terms of kind of taking action for nature, for trees, 2/3 of people wanted to be more involved in decision making about trees, but fewer than a third felt that their voices were heard. We asked about whether people would take kind of specific actions, so from planting a tree in the garden through to becoming a tree warden, which is this kind of graph here. So more than half wanted to contribute in the survey, but obviously not everyone wants to do everything. We did find some differences by age. So older people were more likely to donate money to tree charities, or more likely to contact MPs and councils about tree management, and younger people more likely to say that they would plant and water trees in public spaces. So again, we've got a range of opportunities, that people kind of want to help. So how do we kind of get that sort of action up and running, as it were? There is an infographic, and we have finished the report, and hopefully it will be on the Forest Research website in the next few weeks. But we also want to write a bit about the method that we've used. So this is the kind of, I think, first time we've added more kind of on the social and cultural dimension to an iTree eco project. The method that in terms of the online survey, worked quite well, but we did have a bit of an underrepresentation of people in more deprived communities, and we probably have an overrepresentation of people who are interested in trees, and that's quite a difficult one to address. We want to follow up with the Wirral to see how they might be using the data, whether it's feeding into decision-making, local tree strategy. But we think it is quite a powerful iTree project to bring these things together. So iTree is usually more focused on regulating services, and we've brought in the social and cultural. So we're going to try and see whether that's something that others will be interested in the future. I'd like to move on to talk about another project where we want to include kind of some spatial mapping in a project on kind of social cultural benefits of recreation. We're focusing for this project at Cannock Chase in the Midlands, and we've used spatial data layers of index of multiple deprivation, access points to the area of outstanding natural beauty within the area, and Strava data and some mobile phone data to think about where we might sample people, because we're particularly interested in looking at usage and values and barriers to accessing woodlands at different kind of scales. So at a destination woodland, which is Birches Valley, managed by Forestry England. We also want to look at woodlands that people might be using within 20 kilometres of the AONB, Cannock Chase AONB. And then we also want to look at people's use of woodlands within 1 kilometre of their home. So that kind of fits into this idea of, something within 15 minutes of where people live. And we've developed an R-Shiny app that we can use in the survey so that people can pinpoint where they are and where they're going. So this is a screenshot from the mapping app that we've developed. This is what participants will see when they're out with the surveyor. So the surveyors are going to be out in the area collecting data on the street with people. We've got an outline in blue of the AONB. Birmingham's at the bottom of this screen, and then the black line is the 20-kilometre radius around the wider study area around the AONB. And the text on the side is really just information for the surveyor on using the app. So we're going to ask people about the woodlands that they use for recreation based on those 3 scales, the points of entry into the woodlands, and then something about where they're going within the woodland. So we can pinpoint that up to 4 areas, and we're using what 3 words. So when somebody points to a bit on the map, what 3 words will come up, so we know the kind of exact location. And then we're also going to be asking of these 3 different scales about activities people do, time spent, distance traveled, are they posting things on social media, barriers to accessing woodlands, preferences for kind of woodland creation. So this is work that's ongoing at the moment. We're hoping that this week the surveyors that we've contracted to help us will be going out into the field and collecting data based on our kind of spatial analysis of where we want to capture different types of people in different locations. And then we'll be kind of analysing reporting. But I think what we want to do with this particular project is really kind of understand the use of the kind of mapping app, how practical that is when out surveying people, look at the kind of data that we get back, and are we reaching the kind of target population. So it fits into our work area 2 that we mentioned on programme 3 around sort of methods and techniques and tools for understanding more about what people are doing. Just want to move on now to talk about the Active Forests programme. So this is a partnership between Forestry England and Sport England, trying to create a physical activity habit and connect people with forests. It's been running for quite a long time. So it started with the pilot phase in 2014. In 2017, they went on to a main phase. And now in 2023, we've gone to phase 3. But I'd just like to touch on the second phase of the work that focused on 18 forest sites, so managed by Forestry England. And also within that, there was a social prescribing pilot project, which is also running in phase 3. Key aspects of the programme, so there's a whole kind of range of regular kind of led activities. So things like, buggy fit, boot camp, Pilates, Nordic walking, park run, things that happened on a regular, excuse me, often on a weekly basis. So small groups of people coming together, getting to know each other, helping them to sustain or increase their levels of physical activity. There was a whole range of events also that were organised, so things like Forest Runner, duathlons, Cannock Chase, where people run with their dogs. So these are bigger events, it might be hundreds of people, happen less often, so then, every few months potentially. And there were also kind of infrastructure improvements, new footpaths, like a wild running trail, just improvements in the infrastructure and information. And that led people to being able to do things on their own. So they might not want to join something that's regular. They might not want to join an event, but they might want to make the most of things that were improved. And there was, as I mentioned, a partnership between Forestry England and Sport England was a really strong one. They've been working together now for quite a long time. So Forest Research, we carried out an evaluation. We've got a huge amount of data. We've worked really closely with the 2 partners to collect the data, and active forest coordinators at each of the forest sites have been amazing in also helping us to collect data, and they've been collecting it themselves. And that's been really important. We've been reporting back to the partners on a quarterly basis. So it's led to a really sort of learning and iterative process in evaluation, where the results can feed in and adaptations can be made potentially to the programme. So over the 5 years of the phase 2, there were 4.6 million visits to the 18 forest sites. There was a target of 5 million visits, but obviously COVID happened and that had an impact. So forests were still used, but only by people who lived near to them and could access them by walking or cycling, and only for short periods of time, for example, when we were only allowed out for an hour a day. There was also over 54,000 volunteer visits, so volunteers getting involved in different aspects of the programme. Quite a few of those related to Park Run, which became very, very popular across the sites that were on Park Run. And walking, running and cycling were the kind of key activities in terms of the number of kind of visits that were popular. We asked about the benefits in a survey of to people, and we got over 2,000 responses, and we were running the survey over the 5 years. And there's quite consistent benefits. So the things that have come out on top kind of stayed on top almost for the 5 years, which is interesting. And what's particularly interesting is that mental well-being came out on top, a sense of fun and enjoyment, and a sense of escape and freedom. So obviously this was a physical activity focused program. And it's almost like people sort of took the physical activity as read, but actually the key thing was about mental well-being, having fun and escaping. And I guess particularly under COVID, that sort of escape and freedom side of things was really important. But also feeling close to nature was also important. So there were some USPs, unique selling points of the forest environment that came up through the quantitative and the qualitative research. So we involved nearly 100 people in qualitative research as well. Things around the beauty, the aesthetics of the forest environment. So the 18 sites are some of the big destination sites, have a range of facilities, mixed forests often, open spaces, sometimes water. Also, the variety of the terrain and the landscape was important to people. Things like observing changes in the season, enjoying the flora and fauna, and just getting out into the fresh air was really important. And getting up some of the vitamin D that you can get when out in the sun. So in terms of the physical activity, the fact that the forest was a non-judgmental space. So people said it was not as intimidating as the gym, and women in particular said that was very important, but also that they, didn't feel judged on what they were wearing or doing in the forest in the way that they might if they were in a gym or running, for example, in the street. And they wouldn't get catcalled, as some people mentioned happened to them when they were jogging in urban environments. Also, people talked quite a bit about the infrastructure. So, linking back to Claire's review, things around paths are important. People want a choice of paths. They want good quality paths. Toilets can be important, but also having a cafe or somewhere people can congregate and come together. So quite a lot of the active forest regular activities ended in people having a drink together. So helping that sort of bonding and social connection experience. And people are also interested in information and interpretation as well. You can find out about the Active Forest report. There's a lot of data on the website from the pilot phase, the main phase, the qualitative research. So lots to kind of dig into there. We've got qualitative kind of 2-page case studies for all the different groups that we went to study. So things that Nordic walkers say, or things that people doing Pilates say. And a lot of it is also about the person leading the activity. So a lot of the regular things were led by third-party providers rather than Forestry England, and those people who could encourage, if people are doing Pilates, could encourage them to do the right moves, help to challenge them, help them to improve. Those people are really important. I'd just like to move on now to have 3 slides about 3 new projects that have just started. They will last for 2.5 years. The first one I want to mention is this one around understanding more about public access. We've got 3 kind of work packages within this project that we're going to be looking at. So one is more of a spatial analysis, where is access available, potentially touching on some of the quality of that access. We've got a work package focused on land managers. So really trying to understand from them what might enable or support them to either provide access, whether that's linear access or access to schools for forest school, or access to the general public across all their woodland, but also to understand from managers who might already be providing access, would they be prepared to do a bit more? and what might support that. And then we've also got a work package looking at the public, particularly those publics who are less likely to visit kind of woodlands, and dig into that a bit more, and also look at are there interventions that really help that. And I think some interventions do. Some evidence of the kind of social prescribing from the Active Forest Programme I've just mentioned, helping people who have health problems, haven't visited forest for a while, to come back in and start to access them regularly. We've also got a project, it's really a kind of proof of concept for how we might set up a longitudinal network. So research, social science research, longitudinally over a period of time, qualitative and quantitative, thinking about, would we be focusing on, the same people over time? Would we be also doing cross-sectional kind of surveys, for example? So wanted to kind of dig into that a bit more, focused on communities that have woodland, but also are going to experience woodland creation and or expansion. So at the moment, we're kind of thinking it might be in the Northern Forest region. We want to kind of think about, what are the best methods of data gathering for this, to look at kind of change over time, and also, what sort of approaches we could take to maybe do some deep dives, and that could be through survey work, it could be through kind of qualitative research. So that's going to be quite interesting. We don't know, these are 2.5-year projects, so this will be a proof of concept, something that then could be in place, if we got funding then to carry that on into the future, and think about how often we might want to go back to communities to see how things have changed, as a newly planted woodland has started to grow up and be much more prominent within kind of local landscapes. Another new project around the value of trees outside of woodlands. So we have done some work on kind of trees across, trees in different contexts. But this is really going to focus in much more on kind of trees outside woodlands, so hedgerows, street trees, etc., etc. And this is an interdisciplinary project, so we're working with natural sciences as well. So they're going to be collecting some natural science data, and we want to bring in some of our existing kind of research, but also, potentially gather some qualitative and quantitative data around kind of trees outside woods, particularly in, I think, I was going to say urban, peri-urban, but I'm not entirely sure now. It might be across the urban-rural continuum. So we're kind of coming to the end. So I think I will stop there. I was going to mention one other project, but I think I'm going to stop there because we've been through quite a lot. I'm sure people are kind of a bit bombarded with information, but thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Liz. And I completely can sympathise with the point you made about forests not being as intimidating as the gym. That did make me laugh. But yeah, we've had quite a few questions in already. So if you're happy, I'll just start to list them off. So we've had one through more of a statement maybe from Pippa. So Pippa says it would be good to compare the Cannock Chase research with data collected for protected site strategy, such as SANG and SAM. I believe SANG is suitable alternative natural green space, and I'm sorry, I can't remember what SAM means, but
SAM is sustainable access management and monitoring.
Pippa, we'll look into that and see if we can bring that into the mix.
Yes, it's just a thought that the local authority have already done a whole load of surveying of where people come from to go to Cannock Chase, how long they stay, what their activities are, and just to note that it's interesting that Cannock Chase stands out as having a larger than normal proportion of mountain bikers. I think it's about 25% of users are mountain bike users. And of course, you'll know that cyclists are notoriously difficult to survey because they don't stop to answer questions. I just wondered how you might be getting around that one.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in this particular project that I talked about, the mapping, the surveyors are going out onto the street. So we will be kind of, we're not going into the forest, we're going out into local communities that we've kind of sampled using our, different data layers. So I'm hoping that means we will be able to capture some of those people, but we will be reporting back on that method and approach as how useful it is.
Okay, it'd be good to see that.
Yeah, or maybe even car parks when people are kind of setting up their bikes. We've got quite a long one here from Naomi. So she said, did I understand correctly that people valued ecosystem services the same way if it was in their local area as in areas which they'd never visit? Really interested, if so, is that because it relates to existing values or that they'd expect spread of loss from pests and diseases? There's quite a few different stages to this question, but if not these reasons, what rationale do you think there is for this finding?
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. That did, for some reason, that did surprise us because we thought, people might value local trees and woodlands in terms of social and culture values more than at that sort of more abstract England level. And we've been kind of chewing that over when writing the paper on this project, and we kind of, wondered about whether that's kind of linked to, people develop these sort of relationships with local trees and woodlands, and they kind of almost transfer that to a more kind of general level. So that might be part of it, possibly. In terms of the kind of spread of the loss, so I think it might also be to do with existent values, as you say, existence, and intrinsic value, people valuing woodlands, just for the sake of it and things that they never see. We didn't, again, get much difference regionally about the impact on social culture values from pests and diseases. So that was quite interesting as well. And we're not, entirely sure about that. So that, is that a lot of people aren't aware of many of the pests and diseases being faced by trees, and I guess ash dieback is the most prominent. But I guess when we were asking the question about the big impact on social and culture values, it was about their local. We asked the question about their local woodland. So would their social values cultural values be impacted if there was a large scale loss of trees in their woodlands, or a gradual decline in their local woodlands they visited? So that's much more specific to the local. I hope that covers some of your question.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So one from Joe here has he said, have Wirral Council given any thought on the back of this as to how they will engage with the harder to reach or underrepresented groups?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think, we haven't caught up with them yet. So we're not entirely sure. So we've just kind of delivered the report in the last, 2 or 3 weeks. So we want them to kind of digest it. We've made some kind of, pointers of potential recommendations. So then we do want to follow up and see, what do they think is the most important thing that they want to take from the report? And then what might they put in place potentially? So we can come back to you on that one.
Yeah, and I guess following on from that, Jim's put, have you been able to provide monetary values for the social and cultural values in the iTree Eco Wirral project?
So no, there is an amenity value that comes into iTree Eco projects. So I think that's the only monetary value around the social and cultural. But on the project that I mentioned with DEFRA, on social and cultural values of trees at risk from pests and diseases, we have asked people, we have identified kind of 3 monetary values, because we've asked like different things. So one is, we've asked about people's willingness to pay to protect those values. either through a voluntary donation or through kind of, some sort of increase in local authority payment to local authority, and people went for the kind of voluntary donation side of things. We also asked about people's willingness to travel further if their local woodland was closed because of pest and disease, and you can put a monetary value on that. So we have got we've got distances that people said they were willing to kind of travel, and then finally we have these 6 broad categories of value that you might remember in this project, and we've got quite robust values now from other research around the health and well-being side of things. So your mental and physical health, you've got a kind of we've got robust monetary values, and in the survey we asked people to allocate 100 points across those 6 categories. So we've used we've done what we call sort of anchor value approach. So the health and well-being is the anchor value because it's quite robust, and then given the ways in which people have said which other categories are important or less important, we've kind of then almost kind of transferred that value across proportionally across the other 5 categories. I'm not explaining that too well, and that is a bit of a novel approach, but we are trying to write it up in a paper and see, how that is talked about within the sort of academic community, because it does provide us one way of thinking about the total value of social and cultural values.
Great, thanks, Liz. And then I think we've probably got time just for Pippa's comment. For the identity project, it would be useful to look at the ELM's test 159, which surveyed land managers about providing new permanent public access.
So is that the public access project, Pippa, that you're meaning? Or...
Yeah, there was lots of ELMS tests and trials. And ELMS test 159 looked at creating new permanent public access in the Mendips. And the thing that was a bit different about it was, instead of asking landowners if they were generally interested in access, it went to them with a specific proposition for a sort of route we need to get from A to B, and your land holding is along that route. Would you be willing to consider a dedication of a route, which was a different approach to, I believe, house countryside stewardship or other access projects have sort of gone to landowners and said, are you willing to provide public access, as a general sort of question, which tends to get a lower positive response. And I think possibly the specific proposition and seeing how it works for people and understanding of how it works in a bigger network might help elicit a more positive response.
Yeah, no, that sounds really helpful. Thanks, Pippa. Something really practical rather than just, as you say, something general where they sort of worry about what could this mean for me. So that's, we'll look at that, and that'll give us some ideas for our survey with land managers, but also some of the qualitative interviews with them as well. That's great, thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. So I make that 12 o'clock. So just to say thank you again, Liz and Claire, for taking time to share this great research with us. I guess we can all come together and give you kind of a collective virtual clap. So I'll bring this session to a close, and thank you everyone for attending and for all your questions. Many thanks, and hopefully see you guys soon.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Millie for
Thank
sharing.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.